Well, good afternoon, everybody, or good evening, or good morning, as the case may be. We're here to talk about export controls and multilateral cooperation. And I have with me two other parts of the Scholl Chair team here at CSIS. Emily Benson, who also has her own program in strategic technologies and trade, and Thibault Denamiel, who is our research fellow. And they are the primary authors of two reports more or less on the same subject that we want to talk about today. And since they didn't come out in exactly the same place, we're looking forward to having a good conversation about who's right between the two of them. The Scholl Chair has just issued a report entitled Optimizing U.S. Export Controls for Critical and Emerging Technologies, Working with Partners. And Emily, late last year, put out a paper called Establishing a New Multilateral Export Control Regime. So you can see that we're on the same track, both trying to deal with the question of what we've all realized in the export control business is that these things are really only successful if you can multilateralize them. In a global world, there are many producers of stuff that has critical and national security significance. If you can't get all the relevant producers on board, then whatever you're trying to do is going to be relatively unsuccessful, and technology is going to leak. That has in turn stimulated a debate about the best way to do that. We have some existing regimes, and the papers discuss for a variety of reasons that we can get into a little bit later as to why those are not really fit for purpose right now, given changes that have taken place globally. And so the search is on, I think, not only at CSIS, but amongst other think tanks and in the U.S. government for a better approach to multilateral controls. The appropriation that the House and Senate will presumably pass this week for the Commerce Department, the report that accompanies the appropriation contains a provision instructing BIS, the Bureau for Industry and Security, to issue a report on a bilateral or plurilateral strategy that will get binding commitments on controls to China. So Congress is seized with this issue as well, and that's what we want to discuss today. First, I'm going to ask Thibault to give a brief summary with some slides of the paper that we published just, last week, I guess it was. So Thibault, go ahead.
Thanks, Bill. So this report, the final in a series of three, was meant to analyze critical and emerging technology supply chains to show how the United States could work with economic partners and allies to optimize its export control policy in these different sectors. So that, of course, culminates in a proposal for a specific framework addressing the issue of multilateralizing critical and emerging technologies export controls. So there's a number of critical and emerging technologies, or CET, that we could have explored. The latest White House update on this has 18 different categories, but we tried to focus on those that have received immediate attention from policymakers and have been targeted by tightening economic security policies, given the immediate national security threats that they may pose. So we focused on quantum technologies, semiconductors, biotech, AI, communication and networking technologies, and uncrewed vehicles. So the first is quantum technologies. So as a recap, quantum tech can encompass three fields of national security implications: quantum computing, quantum sensing, and quantum communications. The supply chain of quantum technology inputs flows mostly through Europe, with additional components coming from Canada, Russia, Australia, Northeast Asia, and Southeast Asia. Lasers and electronics are the primary items that comes from these countries. Critical junctures in the supply chain come from, for example, Toptica Photonics in Germany, MOG Labs in Australia, which produce laser diodes, or Low Noise Factory in Sweden, which produces high electron mobility transistors. So the quantum technology supply chain is highly globalized, and if we could get the next slide up, please. And yet suppliers are limited at several points around it. Quantum technologies are so nascent, the demand for their inputs is so low, that leads to the existence of fewer suppliers relative to other CET, and quantum tech inputs can also be extremely technical to produce. Next up, we have semiconductors, probably the most famous or infamous one of these, given the rules that have been coming with it. Semiconductor supply chains, just like all of these CET, are highly complex and global in nature. For leading edge semiconductors, the supply chain has several choke points. Let me just run you through it. The first stage of the semiconductor supply chain is the chip design. Design firms plan the physical makeup of a chip. They optimize its features for different objectives. For today's leading edge chips, for instance, specialized electronic design automation, or EDA software, is required to model the vast complexities of designs with microscopic transistor sizes. Once a chip is designed, it must then be fabricated. The inputs to the fabrication process are raw materials and semiconductor manufacturing equipment, or SME. And within this step of the supply chain as well, there's several types of specialized firms that are necessary to bridge the gap between the design and the actual physical products. Semiconductor fabrication machinery, for instance, is one of the major choke points in the entirety of the supply chain. Modern integrated circuits are developed on semiconductor material using a process called photolithography, which makes use of light beams to build chips with microscopic transistor sizes. And extreme ultraviolet lithography, or EUV, is the state-of-the-art technology for creating those leading-edge chips. It can be utilized to make chips at the 7 nanometer level or below. The last stage that I wanted to discuss is assembly, testing, and packaging, or ATP, which is essentially represented by two business models. In-house services that are performed by the chip maker or outsourced semiconductor assembly and testing company, or ZAP. Next up, we have biotechnology. And again, that term can encompass a wide range of goods and services. They're usually underpinned by the utilization of living cells in a diverse set of end uses. So a high-level overview of the biotechnology supply chain can be broken down into 4 steps. First is the production of active pharmaceutical ingredients, or API, in which firms work to gather raw materials and produce the ingredients that are the core functions of the eventual products. The second step is formulation, where the API is manufactured into a usable product in the right and the core dosage. And the final 2 steps are primary and secondary packaging. The former refers to the materials that are in direct contact to the pharmaceutical product, and the latter sort of the outer packaging that faces the consumer. There are also several hardware inputs that are critical to biotech. Certain types of manufacturing equipment, specifically steel fermentation units or microchamber technologies, have the potential to also play roles as supply chain choke points. Also, increasingly, AI is used as a tool in biotechnology development. Medicines are being discovered using advanced AI and machine learning models. Speaking of which, our next technology is artificial intelligence. You've already probably heard that the United States and other countries, allied or adversaries, are already researching, developing, producing, and or even incorporating AI technologies into their warfighting machines. The AI technology supply chain encompasses both software and hardware. The former includes intangible algorithms, data, and programs used to build and train those AI models.
Cool picture.
Right?
Creepy, but cool, I think.
Thank you. I really like the green underneath it. It highlights the creepiness of it all. Next up, we have communications and networking technologies. Again, there's a wide range of products that are included within that field. For our purposes, we looked at advanced wireless networks, 5G and beyond, and undersea cable networks. So when it comes to wireless networks like 5G, for example, the 5G supply chain can be thought of as 2 separate entities. One is the deployment supply chain, and 2 is the actual service supply chain. Deployment referring to the firms building out that global 5G infrastructure, and service refers to companies that utilize the 5G infrastructure to provide wireless connectivity to the end users. When it comes to undersea cables, one of which you're seeing on the screen right here, The supply chain is actually a little more straightforward than for other CETs. Cables require dry plants on land and then wet plants under the sea. The important stage, the first important stage of undersea cable construction is actually the financing. Cables are owned by private project financiers that in general don't actually physically lay the lines out themselves. The submarine cable installer market itself is actually shared by only a few firms. There's clearly a big four in that market right now. There's Subcom from the United States, there's NEC Corporation from Japan, Alcatel Submarine Networks from France, and then HMN, which is owned by Huawei from China, obviously. And between 2022 and 2025, there are several planned cable installations, ASN being the one that leads the way currently. The last one that we have is uncrewed vehicles. And Bill, I also expect you to think highly of that picture. They have evident capabilities in both military and civilian applications that go a little further down in history than some of these other CETs. Famously, the Predator UAV, the armed mid-sized drone capable of long-term high-altitude deployment, was utilized by the United States in Bosnia in 1995. In 2013, after years of policy debates, we started seeing commercialization of these drones, and that has been dramatically scaled up in the past few years. Armed drone production ranges from the United States and its allies to so-called countries of concern like China, Russia, and Iran. The US has spearheaded armed drone production, but a lot of other militaries have joined that field. As far as the supply chain goes, advanced microelectronics are major inputs to drone technology. However, some drones can make use of lower-end chips. In fact, military drones were put, again, in the US military about 30 years ago with far less advanced chips than what we have right now. Nevertheless, as it stands, the majority of drones still rely on at least some US or allied inputs. For example, there was a study done of the Shahed 136 drone, and it showed that about 34 inputs came from the United States, from microelectronics manufacturer Texas Instruments. So US and allied countries still have some sort of say in the supply chain. So that's about it for supply chain analysis. I could also go into our proposal for the regime.
Please.
All right. So again, as I mentioned, the analysis was done in part to show the necessity of multilateralizing export controls. Evidently, many different countries are involved in these technology supply chains. You can't do this unilaterally. Even if you do, you'll probably be backfilled by foreign firms. So we wanted to come up with a regime that would try to tackle these issues inherent to critical and emerging technologies. And so given that our project looked specifically at optimizing export controls for those CETs, we have a proposal that looks at just that, multilateralizing export controls for critical and emerging technologies. In that spirit, the first thing I want to address is the scope. The definition of what is emerging and what is critical is different from 30 years ago. It may very well be different about 30 years from now. And so the scope of a CET regime should not necessarily be defined according to rigid rules, but rather open to amendments based on the security imperatives of the time and what's considered critical and emerging. In addition, nations that are working together on a CET would miss an opportunity to only focus on export curbs. There's a lot of other issues that are keys to that idea of promote and protect that's central to the policy considerations around these critical emerging technologies. So a new framework, in our idea, would not only have to tackle cross-border transfers of technology, they would also have to tackle the issues of governance and capacity development. To that end, the proposed regime on critical and emerging technologies, or RSET, would have 3 pillars. Again, pillar 1, governance and use of usage, which is sort of meant to set baseline guidelines for both public and private entities on how to engage with these technologies. AI governance has been an issue recently, but it's not the only potential fault line. Biotech is also a type of technology where even in the early days of recombining DNA technologies, It was understood that there are inherent risks to understanding biological mechanisms and the potential harms that could be done with that. That pillar would aim to address these issues. The second is capacity development, which would allow member nations to formulate and coordinate concrete strategies to scale their production capabilities in these different CETs. As you know, the idea of protecting often comes at the expense of promoting if you don't set up policies that sort of counteract that. And nations are already aiming to tackle the rising importance of CETs to national security and economic growth with industrial policy package, for instance. Thinking about the Rapidus example, where governments of the US and Japan were able to coordinate pulling together public and private sector funding to set up a semiconductor manufacturing operation. And the last pillar, which is sort of the main point of this report, is the export curbs pillar, which I'll go into a little more detail. We will get into the different avenues for moving away or expanding upon Wassenaar a little bit later with Emily. But one of the options is the idea of mini sectoral regimes. So each would be devoted to a specific type of technology. Here the membership is more limited, the decision making is more streamlined. However, establishing individual mini regimes would ignore a key feature of CET. Many technologies are intertwined and require a control framework that's conducive to conversations that take more of a holistic approach. And setting up individual mini sectoral regimes would also be diplomatically difficult and challenging to staff for different governments. So the proposed control pillar of our RSET sort of aims to mitigate these issues by adopting a hybrid framework. All the countries that are part of the RSET would be included in the control pillar itself. However, it would be divided into specific sectoral committees in which only members deemed to be critical to the relevant technology supply chains would have a vote regarding control decisions. All countries in the RSET would be invited to all meetings of the individual committees, and they would be able to voice their opinions and their expertise, but only major stakeholders would be able to vote by consensus. And the committee votes would be binding for RSET members at large. Regarding membership, and that's the last point I'll make before we turn it over to our conversation, nations could be added to a committee by consensus of the current voting members, and committee members would have the ability to remove another member nation by consensus vote, minus the country in question. So those are the hypothetical sectoral committees. Based on our supply chain analysis, this is more meant to illustrate the type of idea that we were going for, and it doesn't have to be set in stone. It's just relevant to the sectors that we explored in our supply chain analysis.
Excellent, thank you. First, a reminder to our audience that we hopefully will have time at the end for questions. So if you have any, follow the instructions on the title page of this thing and send us in your questions and we'll try to get to them. But right now we're going to have a conversation. I want to start with Emily, who hasn't had anything to say yet. We haven't given her a chance. So let's begin with the reason why we're here in the first place, which really focuses on the last part of Thibault's presentation. What are the main issues hindering current multilateral export regimes, and why are there mounting calls to change the existing framework?
Well, first, let me say thank you both for inviting me to be here. It's a real pleasure to talk about one of my favorite topics with both of you. I'd also just like to say thank you very much to my research assistant, Katya Muradian, who helped our program put together a comprehensive report over the summer on this topic. Our report really started out with one fundamental question, which is, what is the problem that we're trying to fix? And the problem is that Russia is a member of the Wassenaar Arrangement, the dual-use export control regime, and Russia has used its vote in a consensus-based institution to block meaningful updates of emerging technologies within the Wassenaar regime. That, in turn, has put a broader focus onto other shortcomings of the Wassenaar Arrangement. One major problem is that it's not really suited to confront China-specific controls, and we can unpack some of those geopolitical factors. I think a lot of countries are rightfully afraid of going all in on a policy that would be inherently aimed at and potentially discriminatory towards China. Another issue, and I think this comes up in the critical and emerging technologies framework, is that in some ways Wassenaar suffers from institutional paralysis. And that's not necessarily a unique feature of an international organization. There are many, including the WTO, which convened last week at MC13 in Abu Dhabi, that aren't what they used to be. And so this has really shown a light on what needs to come next. What we propose is to sort of go big or go home. And that's actually very complicated, as especially relates to critical and emerging technologies. What we suggest is to expand the G7 for starters to include the Republic of Korea and Australia. This would demonstrate a degree of flexibility in the admissions process to the G7. It would take with it the Wassenaar Export Control Regime list, from which most participating countries derive their legal authority over export controls. It then would offset costs incurred from controls by complementing export controls with a critical supply chain pillar that would help deepen integration across allies and partners when it comes to scaling up these critical and emerging technologies. So that's a little bit of what we were thinking, and we also tried to take into account what's politically feasible. And I spend a lot of my time talking to G7 governments, and I think there's a strong reluctance to engage, as Thibault pointed out, across many sectoral regimes, because many of the countries in question, of which the United States have asked quite a bit when it comes to export controls on advanced AI chips to China, is that staff is really, really lean. Some countries have just one or two, or in some cases 3 people running their entire export control program. And so to ask them to staff up, which would require legislative change and funding, would be quite gargantuan and I think politically unworkable. At the same time, there is definitely a desire to think about what comes next. And my last kind of bigger comment is that the WTO has been very adept at creating rules of the road for trade, but it's never inherently been a national security organization. It also has not inherently been a supply chains organization. We risk going into this sort of autarkic global economic environment where countries are leaning increasingly on economic security without having effective guardrails for deciding when export controls are permissive or warranted, and then again, what the cost offset mechanism would be. And so my understanding is that there's really a desire to take some of the national security instruments and combine them with a more affirmative side of the agenda to make sure that we're all moving in unison in a more fortified bloc that consists of purely national security goals.
So does your proposal also address the promote side of the promote and protect thing? We had 3 pillars in the one that Thibault described. Do you have the same 3 pillars?
Our pillars are export control parity and investment screening parity as a foundation for deeper cooperation. So the idea here is that you have to have strong confidence in a country not leaking high-grade technology to an adversary. The cost offset mechanism is a supply chains promotion pillar whereby governments work across each other to promote, for example, quantum technology, which remains a very vertically integrated industry and therefore inefficient. Essentially, we're not doing enough to deepen integration and work across countries to scale up, and that will prove costly and could actually cost us time in the long run as well.
So Thibault, how does the other proposal differ from that?
Well, firstly, again, we have sort of three pillars instead of the 2 that Emily mentioned. We are aligned on export curves, and we're aligned on supply chain capabilities, sort of coordinating the development of the capabilities and the relevant technologies among nations, making sure that the relevant industrial policy packages, for instance, aren't contradictory to each other or they don't create redundancies or waste of resources. We also have that pillar of governance, the idea that countries should also work together to develop common rules of usage, common do's and don'ts for both public and private entities of what should be done with these technologies, because they often come with thorny ethical issues that nations often see eye to eye on, but need a concrete pathway to actually discuss and ensure that the policies actually follow suit.
I think that's where I have a little bit of a different viewpoint, is on the idea that there are philosophical alignment points across even the G7. I mean, if you look at artificial intelligence regulation, for example, Brussels is in a completely different motivational sphere than the United States. Brussels is primarily focused on civil rights and data protection as a mechanism for protecting citizens. In the United States, it's all about national security controls and treating data as an instrument that foreign adversaries can exercise. And so I'm curious if there is some sort of alignment that might come out of some sort of regime where we would be able to overcome these philosophical differences, because I think short of that, we won't be able to reach a greater regulatory framework that would place economically restrictive policies on emerging industries.
That's true, and I realize that my answer sort of implies a catch-22 here because I just stated I'm right either way, but if there is sort of a disagreement between Washington and Brussels when it comes to the policies that should be implemented to govern these technologies, whether it's AI or something else, like biotech, then you should have that concrete framework to let them actually discuss those philosophical differences. You should have that pathway for them to discuss these things, and even if you can't come to concrete policies at the moment, which it looks like we won't be able to right now, you have that platform that enables a discussion.
Which is kind of what Pillar 1 of the RSET is designed to do. I mean, if you look just at AI, for example, that depends upon the export of data. So you get immediately into the question of export controls, and if you're going to think about regulating AI in any given country, you also have to think about what you're going to do with how you're going to control the export and I suppose also the import of data that is AI enabling. That's, I think, why we wanted to try to put all these things together. That may be too big a lift. You know, it may be too, I think you're implying that, it may be too difficult to expect countries to be able to get agreement not only on a common list of technologies that need to be controlled and a common approach to controlling them, but also to agree on other kinds of guardrails and other kinds of control provisions that are relevant. I mean, we see already differences between the EU and the United States, for example, even leaving aside China, on how to deal with privacy, how to control data, and how to control the activities of companies that are in the business of processing and moving data around the world.
I think one more potential consideration, of course, is the definition of national security itself, because the further and further we get away from the existing regimes, and I think Australia Group actually is very well suited to take on biotech tasks. Actually, the Wassenaar arrangement already includes quantum controls and, of course, has been very active in the chip space, and they have geospatial controls on drone technology. So I think there are some existing frameworks that kind of harness a lot of this critical and emerging technology discussion, but couch it in what has traditionally been an international consensus about security risks. When we go further and further into the intangible economy, finding consensus over what constitutes a national security risk is much harder, because we're naturally getting further and further away from the core non-proliferation agenda. So asking countries to come on board, for example, with the administration's latest tranche of 6 categories of data controls from last week on human genomic data or on even personally identifying financial services information, I think that would be pretty tricky in a group where the list would naturally get quite big if financial services data with personal identifiers qualifies admission into a committee.
Well, Thibault, I think the RCEP proposal, as I recall, didn't address membership in exactly as specifically as Emily did. Do you think the G7 plus or the G9, whatever we're going to call it, is the right foundation to build a new regime on, or is it better to do it a different way?
Yeah, and that sort of builds upon one of the realizations when we look at both proposals, right? Well, for one thing, it's a little bit comparing apples and oranges, because here we're talking about multilateralizing export controls of dual-use items in general. We're looking specifically at critical and emerging technologies. And so that has implications for how you deal with China, for example, or membership. When it comes to the difference between the two, we sort of have a proposal of a regime that is an ideal end product in our opinion, but doesn't necessarily provide the launchpad. This idea of starting from the G7, or rather the G9, and also institutionalizing the EU is probably a sound start, even though it does, in the realm of critical and emerging technologies, ignore a few players that would be important, for example, Switzerland, to quantum technology. That's why I think when we were looking at the regime and membership and how we could sort of make sure that we include all the major players, we wanted to look at the ideal end scenario because membership was particularly critical, especially for those technologies that are extremely nascent, like quantum, and require a good amount of buy-in. That being said, the G9 as a launchpad for dual-use goods in general, or moving away from SNR, is also a sound idea.
So Emily, some of the key producers of CET items, as if you go back to the maps that we had a few minutes ago, are not in countries that make your list. How do you deal with that?
I think it's pretty easy, and that is demonstrating flexibility in admissions processes to the G7. The G7 has historically run on GDP value, and that is antiquated for a lot of different reasons, and also the net worth, if you will, of the GDP of the G7 continues to decline. So there are a lot of external factors that mean it's sort of time to shake up the G7 and expand admissions. There's no reason that we could stop at the G9. I think there are true virtues in signaling that the door is open, but that security and export control parity is, again, a foundational layer to getting into the club. And so there's no reason that Switzerland would not eventually be admitted, granted that it can get on the same page with other allies on investment screening and export controls.
Doesn't that change the whole nature and rationale for the G7, though?
The G7 is already heading in a more geopolitical direction. If you look at what came out of the Japanese presidency on economic security, a lot of it was related to finding out ways to build a more affirmative agenda that makes the G7 stronger, not only as an economic bloc, but also a geopolitical one. Export controls and investment screening featured very prominently, and so did energy security issues, supply chain security issues, and so there's tremendous momentum. It just needs a secretariat. It needs to have more durability so that we have a more agile institution that's suited for today.
You agree with that?
I mean, I think the point about membership and the fact that it has to expand and the fact that G7 is already going into a more geostrategic landscape is true. And again, we can see that from Hiroshima. We'll see if Italy actually follows suit. But following presidencies, hopefully we'll take up the momentum from what happened in Japan again. That being said, I don't know how much willingness there is amongst countries that are part of the G7 right now to actually include more nations. You know, Australia and Korea is one thing. We've already heard calls for that from other sources. But then expanding the G9 at that point from here on out, I haven't heard as many proposals to do that from G7 nations, and be curious to see how much open-mindedness there actually would be to set that up.
I just also would note that I think in your report there is sort of a rudimentary list of countries that might be included. I think one that might be worth considering is Denmark, which was left off of the biotechnology category. Denmark actually is home to Novo Nordisk, which is the #1 producer of biotechnology in the world. And I think that shows some of the kind of tricky dynamics in calculating which countries actually produce what types of technologies and whether or not they would necessarily fall into certain categories. So I think to the extent possible that we start not with who's producing what, but who should be at the table as a friend and partner of the United States would be a very simplistic but potentially easier way forward for global economic governance.
That's true, but then you could argue that starting from a new multilateral regime on critical and emerging technologies would perhaps give more flexibility to membership than trying to expand the G7 to include more and more countries, which would be a more difficult process.
I think our goal, well, first, as a reminder, audience, if you have questions, now's the time to send them in. I think our set goal was to make sure that we were including countries that are producing the critical and emerging technologies, which include ones that don't make the cut. I take the point that the G7 is a good starting point. But if you start talking about Denmark, the Netherlands, which is really ASML in that case, but Finland, which is one of the leaders in one key element of quantum technology, for example, these are not these are not likely to be countries that are going to end up in the G7 or the G9. Yet they produce critical and emerging technology components. How do you deal with them?
Well, we actually recommend inviting the EU as a permanent member. And so the Netherlands would be included, same for Denmark. I think Switzerland would be a wonderful addition moving forward after the admission of the Republic of Korea and Australia. But there has been a long time US desire to get one voice on the phone with the European Union, as Henry Kissinger famously said. And this would be kind of one more added boost to the European Union export control regime if we're able to treat them as a more unified body coming into this future framework.
Well, let me ask you about, relevant to that, a feature of the RSET proposal, which is to create essentially committees based on individual technologies. So the idea is you'd have a bigger group, everybody would belong to the big group, but only the people that made, semiconductor related technology or the tools, lithography tools or whatever, would be able to vote and make decisions about what is controlled or what is not controlled in that sector. Same for biotech and so on. Is that a reasonable way to go? Is that a viable way to go, do you think?
I think that gets us into politically tricky waters, if you will. No pun intended, because my next comment's about AUKUS. But we are engaged in really a historic defense arrangement with Australia and the United Kingdom in particular, neither of which have particularly strong semiconductor production hubs. So do we not include them in our closed-door private national security meetings with other allies? That just feels wrong to me in an era when we're trying to get everyone on one bigger page that centers really on the future of export control enforcement. And so I think casting a bigger net, again, taking friendship, friendshoring, the future of a tech-driven economic security strategy would be the best bang for buck.
And I think that was a key consideration when we formulated the RSET as well, because we didn't want to shut out different countries that were key to the friendshoring policy, but didn't necessarily have a significant stake in those technology supply chains. The idea of having the significant stakeholders have voting power, but then having the other countries are part of the RSET in other capacity, be able to view the negotiations and contribute their opinions to negotiations, voice their opinions on the vote, that would at least give some transparency and some amount of buy-in and make the regime a more unified body.
Well, the good news is, as proof that we actually have people listening, we have a number of questions from the audience, and they're good ones. So I'm going to run through those. And the first really are for both Emily and Thibault in slightly different ways. So Emily, in your conversations with G7 governments, how do they feel about expanding membership? And Thibault, in your conversations with governments in the various sectoral committees, how did they feel about using this model? Who wants to go first?
Happy to take that one. I think there is a broad recognition among some of our close G7 partners that we need new rules of the road for economic security, and that an expanded G7 that has bare bones staff is a really effective way to go about it. Because otherwise, again, we're looking at this autarkic economic environment in which unilateral export controls prevail, but don't end up succeeding, and they come at great cost. And so in conversations I've had, this idea has been very well received.
So Thibault, what about what you're hearing from the countries that we were talking about?
So I think I wish I could be as positive as Emily on this question, and I admit that's where the idea of providing an ideal end product plays into this conversation, which is sort of what we did in our conversations with different governments. When you provide that sort of framework, especially when you sort of limit the conversations to committees of specialized countries, then you still do have a sense that not all countries are going to have an equal share in the way they can participate to these conversations. And so you're getting more mixed feelings about it, but that's necessary. That's not the only thing that you should be considering when you're trying to formulate that kind of regime. You should also be thinking about what's the best policy outcome. And so in that way, you know, that this idea of a launch pad is probably something that's a little more doable right off the bat. But then having this full-fledged regime where everyone can participate in every technology committee wouldn't be efficient, especially if you have a vote by consensus, which we do for committees right now. So the idea of limiting it makes it a product that has a more streamlined decision-making process, and that's what we're aiming for.
So Emily, do you believe, this relates actually to something that you've already written about, do you believe the Italian G7 presidency is poised to take up economic security work?
I do. They're actually very well suited to take this on. They famously recently announced that they would leave the Belt and Road Initiative. That's a very strong signal that they are in it to win it when it comes to economic security. I'll also just preview something that Katya and I are working on, along with a partner in the UK, Francesca Gueretti. We are looking at the Italian exposure to graphite restrictions from China. And I think our goal is to get this out ahead of the G7 so that we can really show what critical risk exposure looks like and downstream consequences. And so I'm convinced that Italy is getting the message and that they're very engaged not only on economic security, but also on the digital front, on AI.
And so now for both of you, I think I know the answer, but we need to get it out. As new technologies emerge, both of your ideas have the flexibility to incorporate these new technologies into their work streams?
Well, I would argue that the entire point of the presentation and the regime really is to involve the critical emerging technologies in their decision-making process. It's the idea of committee. That's the entire purpose of being of the regime. And I think I could be understanding, the question could be interpreted in one of two ways. Do you mean getting the technology to be part of the logistical work stream of the regime, or just be part of the policy considerations of the regime? Because if that's the latter, which is how I'm interpreting it, then that's sort of the entire purpose of it. That's the reason why we wanted specific memberships, to make sure that we could have specialized decision-making from the nations that have a major stake in those supply chains. So that was the reason why we formulated the RSA in the first place.
Our policy proposal is very simple. Basically, take Wassenaar, put it in a new thing where costs are offset through this other mechanism, and continue to update and make sure that you focus on critical and emerging technology. It's essentially the same thing. It feels familiar. People know how to do it. Lawyers around the world know how to design compliance programs around it, and export control officers know what it looks and feels like. And so, yeah, I think it would absolutely leave room for continued updates, just like Wassenaar has done.
I think a takeaway from both proposals is that no matter what, there's sort of an urgency that's involved with critical emerging technologies and multilateralizing controls, as well as other policy considerations like supply chain development around them. This is a space where we're already seeing a lot of different fragmented policies, even though there's sort of an understanding that you have to tighten the belt around specific technologies like semiconductors and quantum. That's being done in the United States and in Europe. There still needs to be that framework that sort of centralizes export controls, specifically when it comes to these sectors. We're already playing catch up, and so it's time to get moving.
Well, we're at time, but let me close with one more question. We asked about the G7 and the other participants and where they were on this. We didn't ask about where the U.S. government is on this. Would either of you want to comment on where you think, how far along in their thinking is the U.S. government on what they want to do with respect to a new regime?
I mean, I think we've already seen a number of statements from current U.S. officials that realize that it's already time for a new multilateral export control regime, that for the number of reasons that Emily mentioned, chief among them Russia's membership in Wassenaar, we're now at a relative standstill. We're part of a framework that is not nearly as efficient as it should be. There's a recognition, and that's sort of the entire reason why we're seeing unilateral rules and bilateral deals with other countries around some of these technologies like semiconductors with Japan and the Netherlands, because you have to work outside of the established system. Given that understanding and some of the statements from officials like Alan Estevez, who knows that it's time to move on and try to formulate something else, then the U.S. government seems ready.
So Emily, do you want to have the second to last word?
Sure. It is not my understanding that the U.S. government has any sort of consensus on what to do next. There are so many different constituencies and then different people working within each agency that would effectuate this decision. There are a lot of different proposals that are floating around. One that was very interesting, I recently hosted Commissioner Dombrovskis on the sidelines of the TTC, and he seemed to think that a Wassenaar -1 arrangement was the highest currency idea right now. I think that's problematic and surprising on a lot of fronts. I will note, however, that it sounds like the Bureau of Industry and Security is currently undergoing a major research effort to figure out what ought to come next. I think that in itself is a very positive sign to take time, do the research, really get it right. And so I'm anxious to see what that report eventually produces.
For those of you that may not be up on the vocabulary, Wassenaar -1 means the existing arrangement without Russia. And there are mechanical issues about how you would get there, but it's a proposal that's obviously circulating. And as I noted in the beginning, it's good that BIS is doing that research because the Appropriations Committee is telling them to do it. And so hopefully there will be an outcome there, or a study that we'll all be able to see soon. That's what we've got. This is the beginning, I think, of the debate. It's not the beginning. The debate's been going on for a while, but we thought that it would be useful for CSIS to try to sharpen up the debate a bit and put some proposals out there for conversation and debate. I'm delighted that we had some good questions about it, and I think this is not going to be the last you hear either from us or from others, both in the government and outside, on this issue. So thank you for listening, and we hope that you'll tune back in again when we have a similar conversation in the future.